about that. I was getting double echo because I have the Twitch stream open as well. So huge thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity. Thank you to the Lethbridge College for putting this event on. That's absolutely incredible. Thank you for everybody who's coming out and to all the amazing presenters. I'm going to go ahead and just pull up the presentation. Let's see if we can find it in here. Oh, there we go. Now I'm going to bring up some 3D models, but a word of caution to everybody in VR and to everybody in VR. So I apologize in advance if the models look a little weird. My advice is to close your right eye for a moment and it will make a little bit more sense. Okay. Should be the one. And slide it all the way over there. So can everybody see everything okay? Wave at me if that's a yes. I know I see some kind of almost waving. I'll assume that's a yes. So there we go. Hello and welcome. This is our presentation's a little cut off, it looks like.
Try zooming out on the PDF viewer.
Yeah, that would make sense. There we go. So we're going to be presenting 3 challenges and 1 opportunity of a video game startup. I'm going to start with the 3 challenges and Rosalinda will cover the second half after. So 3 challenges and a little bit about me. So my name is Lloyd Summers. I'm the technical co-founder at Red Iron Labs. I've worked at a lot of big companies, a lot of small companies. I've released a lot of mobile apps and games. And that's kind of my history. But personally, I'm a self-taught person. And so it's really important to me to build up community, to build up team members, to cross-train and do things internally. And it was actually while working at a startup about 3 years ago that we decided to take a step back and launch our own game company. So what do? Well, we create video games. Science says video games are pretty cool. Therefore, we must also be pretty cool, or at least that's my rationalization. So a little bit about us. Well, we do create video games. That's mainly what we do, but occasionally we also offer digital media services, prototyping, VR solutions to other startups, and we're in our 3rd year of VR content development. And I think that's pretty awesome. It's been an absolute blast. We've found out that it's a really small community, and so we do put some time into helping other startups who are less enabled to do VR technology to get to the door. So once in a while, if the relationship is right, we do contracting and consulting services as well. So what do you do here?
Okay,
well, that's always an interesting question.
What I did was I sorted people.
We have a less formal structure.
The way that they were
we
categorized there, I kind of moved them around in the
have
map
people from all over the team that do kind of all different things. And part of that's being a game studio. Everybody has to fit all parts at all times. I tend to oversee the development, modeling, and animation, complex and creative types of stuff. So I get to kind of see everything really interesting, but also problematic when we go to work with a client or release a game. So today I'm going to cover 3 common challenges that we've seen that new studios are also likely to see. And for some of you, this may be information you already know about. So disclaimer moment, your mileage may vary. The information I'm going to cover is generalized to kind of speed up this conversation, but everything we cover today is intended to be something to help you kind of make those steps at your own company or your own journey. And some of this is information that's come from people who've been working in the industry longer than I have, as well as it'll be very subjective. So just keep in mind that for the point of getting through the presentation, I'll try to keep it brief. So the first challenge I'm going to cover is realism. So I'm sure most people here know some of the misconceptions, but realism comes down to 2 things. There's the realism of what you can see in the headset, and that's always improving. And then there's the realism of the environment being created by the development team, and that's where things change. So one of the misconceptions, and I'm sure everybody's heard this, that VR is so real, somebody's going to get lost and never come out of VR again or not know that they're stuck in VR. And I think we all know that we're not quite there yet, but we're getting closer. At the same time, there's also a misconception that VR can never feel real, that VR is always something you can see through, and that's not entirely true either. The reality is if that was the case, we wouldn't have VR sickness. VR sickness tends to happen when what you see doesn't match reality. There's your body's understanding and your brain's understanding some of it, and it just can't put the pieces together. That's how you usually start getting sick. So obviously we believe a little bit, just not all of it. So I'm going to talk for a moment about VR gamers. Now, for business users, it's a little bit different because they tend to be forced into using an application for a purpose. They might enjoy it, but they have to use it to complete a job or a role. So they really get very little choice in it. A gamer, on the other hand, is different. A gamer will go out and purchase the game in advance, excited to play it, and they will suspend their disbelief and make themselves believe the environment is real. So our first goal at all costs is to maintain that illusion. So I've seen firsthand where sometimes a game could be lacking in some areas, but as long as it maintains that feel and that story and it allows them to stay in that immersion, they genuinely seem to enjoy it. And there's some ways that we can do that. One is accuracy of scale. So take, for example, a doorway. If the doorway is too small or the doorknob's too big, and we had this problem at the start, and I'll talk about that later a little bit. So if you have those issues, players will come up to the door and the door doesn't make sense. They feel like a giant or something's off and they just kind of disconnect from the game. At the same time, there's also the perception of space. So if we take a look at this room, for example, there's lines everywhere all around us directing our eyes and kind of making it so we understand the perception of the space around us. And this perception and these lines is what allows us to think of where we're standing and where we are. Simple games don't have the ability to sometimes do that, so they have to draw hard lines and places. Just be aware that that perception of space needs to happen and has to be there. Otherwise, somebody will lose their balance, get uncomfortable, or something like that. So that's all part of the realism. Next part, which is kind of the biggest part I see, is the simplification in VR. So a lot of, as we keep experimenting, things keep getting more and more complex. But what I found is that a really complex user could actually get by with a simple control set. A simple user can't get by with a complex control set. And this is true in business as well as games. So our rule is if you have to explain it, you've missed the mark. And at that point, we need to take a step back and re-examine the experience. So one of the questions I like to ask when we do any work for somebody else or on our new projects when we create games is, does it have to be realistic? And I'm going to go into 2 slides about realism because this is such an important topic. One is what I call don't be clippy TM, also known as the Swayze Effect if you're into that. And the idea is that Clippy tries to be helpful. He sits on the side of your document back in the old days and tries to walk you through stuff, but a lot of times he'll just stand there staring at you, maybe blinking. In VR, that feels very animatronic. So you don't quite connect with the environment. It's a very personal experience. You're walking up to characters, creatures, and people, and you expect eye blinking, eye contact, facial cues, clean animations, direct, random, unique interaction. And anybody working in machine learning will understand what I mean when I say that a little bit of randomization can really change how an experience goes because it's going to try something different it's never done before. And that's kind of real to humanity. We don't always blink at exactly the same time, usually, but not always. So that little bit of change makes it feel just a little bit more realistic. And the last thing is, realistic is hard. So games that we were working on before that would take 6 months are taking us 3 years because we have to make sure that they are so perfect when it comes to realism. So let's talk about the other challenge of realism, which is what if you can't quite get there? We're going to talk about the Uncanny Valley, which I'm sure a lot of people in here have experience with VR already, so this is probably a familiar topic. But the idea is that if you can only get to the 95% of realism, you fall into this terrible little valley down here. Now, if you take a look at the robot on the left, he's pretty good. He's cute, he's happy, he's friendly, he's got a little thing on his belly. He tells me he's in a good mood. The next robot looks fun and happy and excited and running and jumping, and that's great. This robot is going to eat your face when you fall asleep at night, steal your identity, and try to steal your life. It has that kind of look that just unnerves people without even knowing why. And then the last robot has surpassed humanity and has no interest in our existence whatsoever. The idea is that in realism, getting into that area, unless you're like us and you work in horror games, we do a lot of horror games. So for us, we love being in there, but working in business and application in games, you generally want to avoid that. And so that goes back to what I said earlier about wanting to avoid unnecessary realism. Oh, lost my controller. There we go. So the models I have flipping through on the left, you'll see that we have three different models. One's from a mobile game of ours, one's from more of a PC game, and one's from a console game. And this is all about polygons. So obviously our abduction series is more realistic. It takes a lot longer to work on. But we have some technical challenges. And one of those is a limit of polygons, batch calls, and frames per second. So in a traditional video game, you can get by with 30 to 60 frames per second. That's how fast the screen's redrawing. In VR, it has to be 90 frames per second and it has to be 90 in both eyes in order for us to avoid getting motion sickness. And that's really fascinating because we're talking about some games having to go from 30 to 90 frames per second and then do it twice. So to do that, there's two things you want to watch out for. One is batch calls. So batch calls is the number of times it has to iterate over stuff to do just one drawing frame, which is quite common with new, if you have multiple materials. A Navisworks file is really bad for this because they have 10,000, 100,000 materials. That's 100,000 batch calls it has to do just to draw one frame on an eye, unless you bring in some innovation. So get your batch calls below 100 to stay safe. That's a complex topic for another day. Use static batching. There's tricks for that. But my advice is to try to stay under 100. For polygon targets, desktop is different. But for desktop VR, try to stay below 1 million polygons. That gives you a lot of room for working with custom business logic, complex animations, all of the physics and that kind of stuff. On mobile VR, try to stay under 150,000. It's just kind of the sweet spot for me. I found it works the best on kind of even the low-end devices. When you're working in mixed reality, we're talking HoloLens, things of this nature, remember that they got a camera running constantly processing data. And they're also quite often running off of a mobile processor. So you want to get even less polygons. Try to stay under 100,000. Try to stay on that overlay type experience where you're giving people just what they need and not wasting time drawing stuff they can't see. Allow that camera to have some extra life. So there's two quick topics. PC games, we tend to use levels of detail, which means the farther you get away, the smaller the collection of polygons. So we make it an uglier model the farther they go. And on mobile, we traditionally use really low poly. So this is one example, but some of our other some of our other games, we get as low as 20,000 polygons in the entire game. And it's a 3D game that you walk around and play in. That's really optimal for doing that. The challenge is people can get up and close in VR. And I'm going to talk about that next because that's our third challenge for the day. But if you have a really low quality model, they can walk right up to it and see it. And that's a challenge. So the third problem is textures. What is a texture? Well, when the Red Iron Labs cube comes up, it's just a cube with a texture wrapped around it. And it'll cycle over to that in a second. So that's done to make a cube look more interesting, and it's what we do with all of our characters and creatures. So textures mostly take up RAM and a little bit of work on the GPU, but mostly they just sit in RAM. So mobile, we usually trim things down and we try to stay at 64 by 64 pixels, kind of smaller type stuff. And you'll see a kind of a box come up that shows a comparison of the blurriness of them. Desktop games get to about 1K is usually what most desktop games used to target. And when VR came out, the rule was 2K or higher. And that's a really big challenge. Suddenly we're going from some studios working in 64 pixels having to go up to 2048 pixels. And then of course, materials tend to be multi-layer. So we're talking 3 or 4 different textures just to draw one square. When we first got into VR, room scale wasn't really a thing. That kind of came out a little while after. And so we had the challenge of having to take a VR game that was built with traditional approaches and force it into room scale VR. And one of the things you can't control is how close a player will get to the environment. So we've seen firsthand at events where somebody literally would lay on the floor and look at the carpet because they're so excited just to see what a digital carpet looks like up close. In traditional games and first-person shooters, we put barriers that block players from getting that close. So we can't really stop them the same way in traditional VR these days. So my advice is roll with it. Give them the high quality texture. Let them roll around and play on the floor if they're happy. On that note, users have cables. So right now, I know the future's got changes coming, but it's not here yet. And some users will always have the old tech. So cables right now hang out the back of the VR player. You want to avoid allowing them to turn 180. So if you take a look at job simulator and games like this, they always have you look left, right, and forward, but never behind, so that you never have to rotate around and trip and bunch up that cable, and it makes it a lot easier to play. At the same time, try to use just the room scale of the player. Rumi's done a bit of an example of this, where a lot of what I need to do, I can do without leaving my square, which means I don't have to teleport, which means I don't have to keep crisscrossing my room, and I don't have to trip over my cables. So it's a lot of information. For some of you, it was not new information. For some of you, it might be new information. Hopefully, it's new for most people. But the conclusion is, don't overdraw the polygons and batch calls. Don't ignore your players. Don't create evil robots unless that's something you want to do and you want them to eat your face. Or, of course, if you work for the robotic overlords, in which case I salute you. Don't be clippy TM. Things you do want to do is use high-quality textures because they'll get you further. Consider the cable placement at all times. Evaluate the importance of how whether or not it has to be realistic. And if you need more information or want more, I have a good talk with the Calgary Game Developers Association on YouTube where I cover 13 rules, and this is only kind of 3 of them. So that's it for my part of the presentation. I'm going to now hand over the reins to Rosalinda Hernandez. And we just need one moment to get set up over here. Perfect.
So I'm not too sure where I'm standing, but I shall begin. So thank you, Lloyd. And I just want to take a moment, if the GPS model is up, point it out because it will kind of make sense to you later on in the presentation. It might give you an idea of where I'm going to go with this. So today I'm going to be discussing one opportunity that we have begun to realize as a startup in an emerging and disruptive technology company. To give you some context, my academic and professional background is in communications, mostly written communications, but I've also spent the past few years focusing on intercultural competency and delivery and inclusion models in company cultures. At VRARA Labs, I'm building out the who we are part of the company. One of the exciting perks to startups is that there really is no definite processes in place, similar to what you might encounter in corporations or institutions. So in startups, we're not only building our products and services, we're also building our company culture. And like our products and services, our company culture is an extension of ourselves. So my disclaimer is that at VRARA Labs, this is an ongoing journey, and it's our personal journey. But in sharing it, I'm hoping that I will maybe trigger something in some of you to reflect on your approach to diversity and inclusion in your own company culture. So prior to VRARA Labs, I spent significant time working in the corporate sector, mostly in oil and gas. So I have experienced the corporate approach to diversity and inclusion training. Most of it really entailed a series of PowerPoint slides. And if I didn't complete that training, then I would get a series of emails reminding me to complete it. And if I still ignored those emails, then I would get a knock on my door from my manager politely reminding me to complete the diversity course. So at the time I accepted it I'm like, okay, that's just the way it is. And to some extent I still kind of get it because of the size of some of these corporations. How do you evaluate people's accepting of diversity and inclusion? But it really doesn't make it effective. So thinking about it now, it's almost like the accepted corporate approach is to inject diversity and inclusion values into an existing culture. The courses were mandatory, and once it was over, due diligence somehow equated to values. So rather than injecting an existing company culture with diversity and inclusion values, startups have the unique opportunity to take a holistic approach. So I just want to bring in a different kind of concept to this, and that is a LinkedIn video that I saw a couple months ago, and it's one with a retiring CEO, and he gives his top exec seeds and tells them to grow them, and he'll come back in a year's time and choose a successor. And sure enough, he comes back in a year's time, and all of his successors, potential successors, have these beautiful big plants, except for this one gentleman who admitted to trying really hard and his plant didn't grow. Well, it turns out that the CEO gave them all dead plants, and basically the role was honored to the person who was honest and didn't lie. So in the context of the story, the moral is if you plant honesty, you will reap trust. Or build trust. And I want to take that plant concept and apply it to startups. So culture change doesn't happen through injected policies. This disruptive nature of startups empowers us to build up and out. So startup cultures provide the opportunity to plant the seed of diversity and inclusion in our corporate culture. Creating a diverse and inclusive workforce is not only good for the soul, but it's also really good for the bottom line. The Delivering Through Diversity report that came out earlier this year from McKinsey and Company points to a correlation between profits and diversity. And according to the report, these are some findings that what likely drives the relationship with performance is that the more diverse your company, the more likely you are to attract top talent and improve employee engagement, have greater depth of customer insight, and just make better in-depth decisions. In a global economy, it completely makes sense that a diverse and inclusive employee base with a range of approaches and perspectives is more competitive. Not only does this research shed a light on how companies can use diversity as an enabler of business impact, it also articulates a clear opportunity for companies to promote diversity and inclusion in senior decision-making roles and on executive teams. The report above talks about diversity in workforce and inclusion in leadership roles, but what does that mean and how does that impact change? The word diversity is often associated with the composition of a workforce, as if the face is all that matters. This is a common characteristic of stock photography that shows a group of people as a collaborative team, all of whom have different physical features from each other. This is a pictorial representation of what diversity is at a company. A group of people with different gender and ethnic backgrounds working collaboratively as a team. It does not, however, indicate in any way their personal values and experiences are represented or valued. So diversity can be measured, but it doesn't acknowledge the difference of lived experiences. And the approach that we're taking at RedR Labs is to acknowledge different perspectives at the creative and decision-making tables. Perspectives are based on personal experience, which impact how people see and interact with the world around them. And because we typically write about what we know. By including more perspectives, we can create something new and different. In the game development space, this means that different perspectives can create new and creative game narratives. Startups have the unique opportunity to go beyond compositional diversity and engage perspectives. By including their perspective, it can influence what games we make, the stories they tell, and how they are played. A couple of years ago, when I was doing research on the politics of horror, I found that horror is predominantly a Caucasian male-driven genre. The reason being that people with different gender and ethnic backgrounds are more likely to have experienced violence toward them in their real life. From the technical perspective of game development, Lloyd considers the psychological aspects of gameplay much differently from me. So when we're storyboarding our games, I may say things like, who's the hero and who's irrelevant to the storyline, who has the power, and who is giving and receiving the violence. Not to say that Lloyd would completely miss it, but these questions are always on my mind. As a woman and visible minority, I see it and I live it. When we include different perspectives to the creative and decision-making tables, we are acknowledging each other's worldviews and respecting them as significant. So, to give you a different kind of illustration on the concept of including perspectives, I will use Janet Bennett's model of intercultural positioning system, which uses the metaphor of a GPS to discover where we are and where we're going. Much like the locating capacity of a single satellite in GPS is insufficient for precision, the same is true for diversity. If we view developing an inclusive culture as a process like triangulation, we must first locate ourselves to develop our own self-awareness, to explore the gap between our values, beliefs, and behaviors. When we begin to include the position of others, it allows for the inclusion of their perspective. This enables us to have a more inclusive view and captures experiences that we may miss otherwise. So just as the GPS system can be used to determine where we are and where we're going, the same principles apply to diversity and inclusion. So as I mentioned at the start, the startup environment provides an opportunity to be innovative not only in our technologies, but how we create company culture. The ways in which we at Red Iron Labs have begun to define our culture and be inclusive of perspectives is by connecting to communities and building positive relationships for a mutual beneficial partnership. In Calgary, some of the communities that you may want to consider reaching out to are Chic Geek, which is a Calgary-based nonprofit building a welcoming, supportive community for women at the intersection of technology and entrepreneurship. They contacted us a couple weeks ago. They're looking for some mentors who are skilled in development. I'm not too sure if they're still looking for it, but they're a really great organization to reach out to. As well as there's the Calgary School of Informal Education, which is a network of peers who facilitate classes, workshops, and skill-sharing events outside of traditional institutional setting. Their classes are for people to share knowledge and experiences, make connections, and learn from one another. They make a space for everyone to come together.
All right, so we're going to open this up to questions. Also, a side note, the stream did crash for a minute or so that last bit is a bit cut off, so we apologize about that, but the bulk of the content was seen by the live stream, so looks like we have a question up here, so why don't you go ahead?
Ask away.
Hello? You guys hear me?
Hi.
You guys had a really good presentation. I'm just wondering if you guys have a link to your, basically your presentation.
Yeah, we can definitely provide that. Mike, I don't know if you're going to facilitate that. But we can definitely provide a link to our presentation. If you want to maybe reach out to us on LinkedIn, or Mike can set up an email and we can provide it to him.
I can, yeah, I'll drop it in the Twitch chat as well.
Oh, okay.
Okay, cool.
That works.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
Cool.
Hey guys, just a quick note. This is Chance Glasgow from Doghead Simulations. Make sure you're not using speakers. Use headphones only, because you'll have echo if you use speakers.
Cool. So I think that sounds like that's it. Well, thank you very much, everybody. It's been a wonderful day, and good luck with the rest of the events.
Yeah, sorry about that. I got kicked from the session. If there are any more questions, we can do that. Armo, we have a closing keynote. Please go ahead.
Yep. Just had a question regarding the textures, because you mentioned using 2K resolution textures, but that seems mostly targeted for desktop VR. As we are developing a mobile VR, do you still recommend you going for 2K with the limited resources, or should we still aim for lower in that case?
That's a really good question, and a complex one, because it depends a lot on the game, right? So if you're, the mobile game we're working on right now is very poly driven, so very low poly. Absolutely stick to 16 by 16 textures, go really small if you can, because it mostly uses up memory, and you have such limited ones, especially on low-end mobile devices. But if you're working on a game that's like a serious over-the-top like game where you really want that realism, like even in here, for example, if you needed that realism, I would bring it in. But to your point, that will slow down your experience in mobile. And you'd want to really limit the number of textures you have at that high quality because, yeah, you will kill the RAM and the GPU pretty quickly if you stay too high. It is mostly for desktop that I would push for that because on desktop you have, 16 gigs of RAM. That's a lot of room to dump textures, but mobile, you want to try to keep everything running within about 500 megs or less of RAM. So kind of keep that in mind in your calculation, if that helps. It's kind of a non-answer, but.
So yeah, I think that's all the time we have. So thank you for speaking for us.
Thanks, everybody.